Imagine surviving hell, watching your family perish, enduring starvation, and witnessing unspeakable brutality. You cry out for help, but you learn that just speaking up could cost you your freedom or your life. Over 1.2 million Armenians were killed between 1915 and 1923. But instead of justice, the survivors faced silence. Their stories were buried, their pain denied, and the world turned away. How did such a well-documented tragedy get swept under the rug in front of everyone's eyes? To make sense of this, we need to understand the Armenians and the Ottoman Empire in its final days. Armenians are one of the oldest Christian nations, having adopted Christianity as their official religion in 301 CE. They had a rich cultural heritage with contributions to art, literature, architecture, and trade. Before the genocide, they lived in a region of the Ottoman Empire known as Western Armenia, as well as in Constantinople and Anatolia. They formed a significant portion of the middle and upper classes. Their cultural and economic influence was considerable, but it also made them targets of envy and suspicion. Being part of the millet system, which organized the empire's population based on religious affiliation, Armenians were classified as a dhimmi community, granting them protection, but also marking them as second-class citizens. They paid special taxes, faced restrictions on their attire and homes, and were barred from certain professions and military service. Despite these limitations, the Armenian Church was a vital center of community life, offering education, social support, and a sense of identity. But when the Ottoman Empire declined in the 19th century, it brought significant changes to the region. Nationalist movements spread like wildfire. Ethnic and religious groups sought greater autonomy. Reforms aimed at modernizing the empire promised equal rights to all subjects, but often failed to materialize for Armenians, fueling resentment. In rural areas, Armenians were vulnerable to attacks from Kurdish tribes and corrupt Ottoman officials. They often seized Armenian lands and imposed harsh conditions. This drove the Armenians to push even harder for equality. However, rising Armenian activism for equal rights led to violent crackdowns, most notably the Hamidian massacres between 1894 to 1896 under Sultan Abdul Hamid II. Between 100,000 and 300,000 Armenians were killed during these massacres. These events marked a precursor to the genocide, highlighting the empire's growing hostility toward them. By the early 20th century, Armenians were deeply integrated into Ottoman society, particularly in urban centers like Constantinople. The Young Turk Revolution of 1908 briefly raised hopes for equality, as it promised constitutional reforms and inclusivity. But this optimism was short-lived. The ruling Committee of Union and Progress viewed Armenians as a threat to their vision of a homogeneous Turkish state. And as the First World War began, the once mighty empire was crumbling under the weight of internal dissent and external pressures. Amid this turmoil, a dangerous idea took hold. The Armenians were betraying the empire. They became scapegoats, being falsely accused of collaborating with enemy powers during World War I. What followed was a meticulously planned campaign of extermination. Families were torn from their homes and forced onto death marches into the Syrian desert, where starvation awaited them. They faced unimaginable horrors, and entire villages were wiped from existence. But how do we know all of this? The Armenian Genocide is one of the most extensively documented atrocities of the 20th century. It was recorded through countless accounts and photographic evidence. Missionaries, foreign diplomats, and journalists stationed in the Ottoman Empire during the genocide bore witness to the systematic extermination of the Armenian population. U.S. Ambassador Henry Morgenthau Sr. detailed the mass deportations, killings, and starvation faced by Armenians. He described it as a carefully planned scheme to thoroughly extinguish the Armenian race. Meanwhile, missionaries working with Armenian communities sent harrowing letters and reports back to their home countries, providing first-hand accounts of the massacres and the suffering of survivors. Photographs taken by individuals such as Armin T. Wegener captured the horror of death marches and the conditions in concentration camps. The New York Times alone published over 100 articles about the genocide between 1915 and 1922. Additionally, the Armenian diaspora and survivors documented their experiences through memoirs and oral histories, preserving the personal stories of those who endured. But the governments stayed silent. Due to the chaos of World War I, the genocide was overshadowed. For the Allied powers, defeating the Ottoman Empire took precedence over saving lives. This silence echoed across history. Even Adolf Hitler, planning his own genocide, took note. Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians? He asked, emboldened by the world's indifference. After the genocide, the Turkish government launched a campaign of denial, one that continues to this day. Evidence was destroyed, records were altered, and survivors were silenced. Speaking the truth became a punishable crime under laws like Article 301, which criminalizes insulting Turkishness. But it didn't stop there. The Cold War brought a new layer to the denial of the genocide. Turkey's strategic position as a NATO ally made it a critical bulwark against Soviet expansion. The West chose to overlook historical accountability in favor of geopolitical stability. During this period, Turkey's role as a NATO member shielded it from international scrutiny. Governments feared that pressing the issue of the genocide might push Turkey closer to the Soviet sphere of influence. In this delicate balance of power, the truth was sacrificed on the altar of politics. Through a mix of censorship, intimidation, and geopolitical leverage, the truth was buried beneath a web of lies. But even then, the story spread. Across the world, Armenian communities have fought tirelessly to keep the memory of the genocide alive. Over 30 countries, including France, Germany, and the United States, have formally recognized the genocide. And as one can expect, every step against the grain comes with resistance.